The morning the Blackwater Creek shifted its main channel 14 inches to the east during the heaviest rainfall event Coles County had recorded in 31 years, moving through the precise gap that the Ridgecrest HOA board had created 11 months earlier when they demolished my creek barrier without authorization. I was in my workshop 200 yards from the creek, monitoring the event on my trail camera system and my water level sensor array, and I was not surprised because I had predicted this specific outcome in writing to the board on 4 separate occasions and had been laughed at, dismissed, ignored, and ultimately sued for obstruction when I attempted to prevent the demolition through legal channels. And I want to tell you that what I felt watching the water move through that gap in real time was not satisfaction and not vindication, but the specific grief of a person who understood exactly what was happening and had done everything available to them to prevent it and had not been able to. My name is Silas Marsh. I am 58 years old, a licensed fluvial geomorphologist and watershed engineer with 31 years of experience in river channel dynamics, erosion control, and riparian infrastructure design, and I have lived on the eastern boundary of the Ridgecrest HOA development in central Virginia for 9 years. My property backs onto Blackwater Creek, a third-order tributary of the larger watershed system that drains approximately 12 square miles of mixed agricultural and residential land to the north and west. I had bought this specific property because of the creek. I had spent my entire professional career studying waterways, and I had wanted to live adjacent to one, and I had found this property and the creek access, and I had understood from my first professional assessment of the site exactly what living adjacent to Blackwater Creek required in terms of responsible management. What it required was a creek barrier. Not a dam, not a diversion. A barrier of the specific type that riparian engineers design for residential properties adjacent to dynamic creek systems. A structure that maintained the natural flow regime while preventing the specific hazard that Blackwater Creek presented to the adjacent residential land, which was lateral channel migration. Blackwater Creek was a meandering stream in a reach that was actively working through its meander belt, meaning the channel position was not fixed, but was migrating slowly and predictably toward the east across the floodplain it occupied. My property sat at the eastern edge of the current channel's meander belt. Without intervention, the channel would eventually migrate into the residential area behind my property and potentially into properties further east. The barrier I had designed and installed in my second year on the property was a bank stabilization structure, not a wall. It consisted of a continuous line of interlocking concrete revetment blocks anchored to a concrete footer at the toe of the bank, backed by a filter fabric and gravel drainage layer, with native willow and elderberry plantings established along the top of the revetment that provided root reinforcement to the bank's soil above the concrete structure. The design was consistent with Virginia Department of Environmental Quality Guidelines for riparian bank stabilization. It had been permitted by the county, reviewed by the VDEQ, and installed by a licensed contractor whose experience included similar riparian work on 4 other creek properties in the watershed. The barrier had performed exactly as designed for 7 years. The creek bank at my property had been stable, while adjacent properties upstream and downstream had experienced varying degrees of bank erosion consistent with the creek's natural lateral migration tendency. My barrier had interrupted the migration at my property, and the creek had accommodated this interruption by working around it in the way that streams accommodate fixed obstacles, adjusting its energy distribution across the channel width rather than attacking the stabilized bank. This process had produced a secondary effect that I had anticipated in my design analysis and that I had documented in my permit application. The stabilized bank at my property had directed the creek's erosive energy toward the opposite bank and toward the section of bank immediately downstream of my barrier where the bank was not stabilized. This was a predictable hydraulic consequence of bank stabilization in a migrating stream reach, and it was one of the reasons the VDEQ required permit review for riparian bank work, to ensure that the protection of one bank did not create unacceptable impacts at adjacent locations. In my case, the downstream impact zone was the property immediately south of mine, which was owned by a man named Carl Whitmore, who was not an HOA member because his property predated the development and was not within the development's boundaries. Carl had been aware of the downstream impact for 5 years and had periodically raised concerns about bank erosion on his property. I had spoken with Carl on 3 occasions and had offered to extend the revetment onto his bank at cost, which he had declined the first 2 times and accepted in principle the 3rd time, but not yet formally agreed to. The upstream impact zone extended into the HOA's common area, which included a 30-foot wide naturalized buffer strip between the rear lots and the creek. This buffer strip was HOA property, and it showed evidence of active bank erosion that I had documented in 3 written communications to the board over 5 years, each time recommending that the HOA consider bank stabilization work on the common area frontage and offering to provide design services at a reduced professional rate, given my proximity and familiarity with the site. The board had not acted on these recommendations under the prior board leadership. Under the prior board president, a retired hydrologist named Howard Birch, the lack of action had been a resource and priority question. Howard had read my letters carefully and had told me he found them technically sound, but that the board had not been able to budget the work. I had accepted this and continued monitoring. Constance Heller had become board president 16 months ago. I had known from her first board meeting that she and I were going to have a different kind of relationship than I had with Howard, because her first board meeting had included a presentation on community aesthetics in which she had displayed photographs of what she called unsightly riparian infrastructure along the creek buffer, including a photograph of my revetment visible from the common area pathway that ran along the buffer strip. She had not named my property in the presentation, but the photograph was unmistakably mine and the context was unmistakably critical. I had attended the meeting. When the presentation concluded, I had raised my hand and been recognized, and had explained that the structure in the photograph was a permitted riparian bank stabilization structure designed by a licensed fluvial geomorphologist and installed in accordance with VDEQ guidelines, and that it was performing an essential function in protecting the creek bank at my property from lateral channel migration. Constance had thanked me for the information and had noted that the board would review the matter. The review had taken 3 months and had produced a formal finding that my revetment was a non-conforming structure under the HOA's creek buffer management policy, which was a policy document that Constance had apparently drafted, and the board had approved at a closed session meeting I had not been notified of. The policy prohibited what it called artificial hardscape structures within 15 feet of the creek bank, a definition that encompassed my revetment. I had reviewed the policy document. It had been drafted without engineering input, without consultation with the VDEQ, and without reference to the county permit that authorized my revetment. It had been approved by a board that included Constance, 2 members who had been appointed since her tenure began, and the 2 remaining members from prior boards who I subsequently learned had been absent from the session when the policy was approved. I had called James Waller from my workshop that evening. James had handled my property matters for 9 years and was familiar with the creek and the revetment. He said, "They adopted a buffer management policy that conflicts with your county permit." I said the permit was issued by the county and reviewed by the VDEQ. The HOA does not have jurisdiction over structures permitted by state and county authority on private property adjacent to a state-regulated waterway. James said, "I agree. I am going to send a letter today. How urgent is the situation?" I said, "Constance is the kind of person who moves before the legal response arrives. I want the letter today." The letter went that afternoon. It was 9 pages, citing the county permit, the VDEQ review record, Virginia's Riparian Management Act, and the specific statutory provision that reserved primary jurisdiction over structures adjacent to state-regulated waterways to the relevant state agency and not to local homeowner associations. Constance's attorney, a man named Douglas Pierce, responded within a week. His response was 2 pages and argued that the HOA's buffer management policy was a community standards instrument that operated independently of state and county permits, and that the board had inherent authority to regulate structures within the development's common area buffer strip, regardless of adjacent private permits. James read the response and called me. He said, he is arguing that the buffer management policy covers structures on private property adjacent to the common area buffer, not structures within the buffer itself. I said my revetment is on my private property. It is adjacent to the HOA's buffer strip, but it is not within the buffer strip. James said that is not entirely clear from the policy language. The policy defines the buffer zone as extending 15 feet from the creek bank on either side of the channel. That definition could be read to include a portion of your property. I said the policy was drafted by an HOA board president without engineering or legal training and approved at a meeting where the informed members were absent. It uses a 15-foot buffer definition that is inconsistent with the VDEQ's regulatory buffer standards and with the county's floodplain management ordinance. It is not a well-drafted policy. James said, it is not, but it exists, and a court could take time to resolve the jurisdictional question. Do you want to seek an injunction? I said yes, file today. He filed the injunction application that afternoon. The application asked the circuit court to prevent Constance and the HOA from taking any enforcement action against my revetment while the underlying jurisdictional question was pending. It included my expert credentials as a fluvial geomorphologist, the permit documentation, the VDEQ review, and a technical statement I had prepared explaining why the revetment was essential to bank stability at my property and what the predicted consequences were of its removal. In the predicted consequences section, I had written, in technical language that I will translate here, that removal of the revetment would allow lateral channel migration to resume at my bank and at the HOA's common area buffer frontage, that the most likely near-term consequence was accelerated erosion of the buffer strip and potential migration of the channel toward the eastern lots of the development, and that during a significant storm event, the probability of a rapid channel shift through the destabilized bank section was meaningful and could occur within 1 to 3 storm seasons depending on rainfall patterns. I had been as specific as I could be without knowing the exact timing of the storm event. I had said meaningful probability. I had said 1 to 3 storm seasons. I had included a technical diagram showing the expected erosion progression. The injunction hearing was set for 3 weeks out. Constance did not wait for the hearing. On a Tuesday morning, 12 days after the application was filed, while I was at a site visit for a client in Richmond, my trail camera sent an alert showing a crew from a landscaping company called Summit Ground Services working at my creek bank. They were removing the willow and elderberry plantings at the top of the revetment. They had bolt cutters on the revetment blocks. I called James from the highway. He said, same situation as before. They are proceeding during pending proceedings. I said the revetment is not a hedge. If they damage the structure, the bank is immediately destabilized. Every rain event after that is a risk event. James said, I am filing an emergency motion right now. Turn around and get home. I turned around. I drove the 3 hours back at a speed I will not specify. I arrived to find the revetment partially dismantled, approximately 40 feet of the continuous structure removed from the southern end, the anchor blocks pulled and stacked on the bank above the disruption. The filter fabric had been torn. The toe of the bank was exposed below the removed section. The crew had left by the time I arrived. I photographed everything. I called the county environmental inspector and the VDEQ regional office simultaneously. Both said they would send inspectors. I called Carl Whitmore and told him what had happened and recommended he document his bank condition immediately. Carl did so and sent me the photographs within the hour, which showed his bank as it had been before the event, a before condition record that would become relevant later. The emergency motion produced a hearing the following morning. James presented the photographs, the alert footage, the injunction application with the technical statement, and the specific prediction about bank destabilization. Judge Sandra Whitmore reviewed the materials, noted the pattern of proceeding during pending judicial process that had appeared in prior accounts involving this court, and issued an emergency order halting further work and directing the HOA to restore the removed section of revetment to its prior condition within 30 days. The HOA's contractor attempted to restore the revetment. The attempt was inadequate because the contractor had no experience with riparian revetment installation and reinstalled the blocks without the filter fabric backing and without the tow anchor that provided the structure's stability against hydraulic uplift forces. I documented the inadequate restoration in a technical report that James filed with the court as a supplemental exhibit. The court ordered a second restoration attempt using a contractor with documented riparian experience. The second attempt was better but still not to the original specification because the original specification required continuity with the surrounding undisturbed sections of the revetment, and the disrupted section's soil had been disturbed enough that achieving the original soil block interface was no longer possible. I documented this too. My technical report described the remaining vulnerability in the restored section and repeated the prediction from the injunction application about storm event risk. The declaratory judgment on the jurisdictional question was resolved 4 months after the emergency order. Judge Whitmore ruled that the HOA's buffer management policy could not supersede the county permit and the VDQ review authority for structure on private property adjacent to a state-regulated waterway. The policy was void as applied to my revetment. The revetment was confirmed as a permitted structure that the HOA had no authority to remove or require the removal of. I should have felt something strong at that ruling. I felt the relief of the legal resolution and the sustained concern of someone looking at a damaged revetment in a creek system heading into a wet season. The storm event that moved the creek came 11 months after the demolition. I had been monitoring the revetment restoration's performance through my sensor array during those 11 months. The restored section had behaved as I had predicted in terms of differential settlement and reduced hydraulic resistance compared to the undisturbed sections. The bank behind the restored section had shown measurable erosion in 3 of the monitoring periods. The gap in structural continuity was doing what structural gaps in riparian revetments do during normal flow conditions, developing slowly and unspectacularly toward the threshold condition at which a significant flow event would trigger rapid change. The rainfall event that triggered the change was a 3-day system in October that delivered 9.4 inches over the watershed, which was the highest 72-hour total in the county's records going back 31 years. The creek rose to the top of its bank and overtopped briefly during the peak of the event. The flow velocity in the reach adjacent to my property was sufficient to exceed the shear stress threshold that the compromised restoration section could resist. The channel shifted 14 inches to the east in approximately 4 hours during the peak flow period. 14 inches. The gap in the revetment continuity was approximately 12 inches wide at the base. The channel exploited a gap of less than 1 foot and moved enough to change the reach geometry and establish a new erosion pattern that would continue to develop through subsequent storm events. The HOA's common area buffer strip lost approximately 8 feet of bank width in the same event. The willows I had planted along the top of the original revetment, the ones the crew had removed, had root systems that would have provided supplemental resistance to the bank erosion that occurred during the overtopping. Their absence was a contributing factor in the buffer strip loss that I documented in the technical report. I began preparing at 6 in the morning after the peak flow had passed. Carl Whitmore's bank had eroded 6 feet during the event. Carl called me at 7 that morning. He said, "Your wall stopped it on your side." I said, "The undisturbed sections of the revetment performed as designed. The restored section failed at the gap." He said, "How bad is the development side?" I said I need to assess, but the buffer strip has lost significant bank width. I believe the channel shift is approximately 14 inches toward the east. Carl said, how far can it go? I said the meander belt extends approximately 40 feet into the current development area before it encounters the first rear lot boundary. At the current migration rate, the channel would reach the lot boundaries in 12 to 15 years without intervention, with storm events of this magnitude accelerating the process, potentially less. Carl was quiet for a moment. He said, you told them this. I said in writing, 4 times. The technical statement in the injunction application was the most specific. It described a 1 to 3 storm season timeline for exactly this type of event. He said, how long ago did you file that? I said, 11 months. He was quiet again. Then he said, what do you need from me? I said, your bank condition photographs from before the event and your current condition photographs. I am preparing a comprehensive technical report for submission to the county, the VDEQ, and James Waller. I want Carl Whitmore's bank condition documented as part of the record. He sent everything within the hour. James filed the expanded civil claim that week. The claim covered the unauthorized demolition during pending proceedings, the inadequate restoration, the damages to my property, including the bank erosion that had occurred at the gap in the improperly restored section, the cost of my expert time in monitoring and documenting the restoration's inadequacy across 11 months, and consequential damages for the channel shift and its predicted ongoing impact on my property. The claim also covered something James had been building since the emergency order and that the channel shift event had made significantly more powerful. He called it foreseeable consequences of inadequate restoration, which was the legal articulation of the fact that I had told them in writing what would happen if they removed the revetment. They had removed it, they had failed to restore it adequately, and the thing I had told them would happen had happened. James filed a copy of my technical statement from the injunction application alongside the civil claim with the specific passage about storm event probability highlighted. He filed a copy of the October storm event data showing the rainfall total and the creek gauge readings. He filed a copy of my post-event technical report showing the channel shift measurement and the bank erosion documentation. He called me after filing and said, the injunction application language is remarkable in this context. I said I wrote it as a professional technical statement. I described what was likely to happen based on 31 years of studying creek systems. He said, and it happened in 11 months. I said these systems are predictable if you understand them. The timeline was uncertain, the mechanism was not. Douglas Pierce called James 2 weeks after the civil claim was filed. Douglas had apparently spent those 2 weeks reviewing the technical record and had reached a conclusion that James described to me as the conclusion a reasonable attorney reaches when his client has been told in specific technical language what would happen, has done the thing that would cause it to happen, and has watched it happen. Douglas said, my client would like to resolve this comprehensively. James said the claim is substantial. The channel shift has produced ongoing consequences that will require professional monitoring and potential additional bank work. The damages are not fully quantified because the situation is still developing. Douglas said, what does resolution look like from your client's perspective? James said, full compensation for the demolition and inadequate restoration damages, the monitoring costs, the professional time, and the consequential damages from the channel shift. We also want a funded remediation account for the bank stabilization work that will be required to address the current channel position. And we want a formal acknowledgement from the board that the buffer management policy did not apply to my client's permitted structure and that my client's technical recommendations on creek management are accepted as authoritative for future board decision-making. Douglas said, the remediation account. James said, my client's technical assessment indicates that restoring bank stability in the affected reach will require riparian engineering work at a cost I estimate at between $80,000 and $120,000, depending on the scope required. That work is the consequence of the inadequate restoration and the channel shift it produced. The HOA needs to fund it. Douglas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "This is a significant exposure." James said, "The exposure exists because your client was told what would happen and proceeded anyway. The technical record supporting causation is unusually complete." The negotiation took 6 weeks. The HOA's insurance carrier was deeply involved because the exposure included potential future damages to HOA common area property and potentially to the eastern lot properties if the channel migration continued. The carrier had retained their own riparian engineer to review my technical report and had received from their engineer substantially the same assessment I had provided, which was that the channel shift was causally connected to the demolition and inadequate restoration, and that the ongoing migration risk was real. The settlement was $240,000. The HOA's insurance covered $180,000. The HOA paid $60,000 from reserve funds, which required a special assessment to replenish, and which generated a community meeting at which Constance Heller faced questions from residents that James described to me based on Gerald Alderman's account as among the most direct questions a sitting board president had faced at a Ridgecrest Commons meeting in recent memory. Constance resigned from the board 2 weeks after the settlement. The resignation was quiet, a 2-sentence email. Gerald Alderman was elected president at the following board meeting. The remediation work was designed by my firm and executed by a licensed riparian contractor over 3 months in the spring following the settlement. The channel was stabilized in its new position rather than returned to its prior position, which was the technically correct approach because the new position was hydraulically stable and remigration to the prior position would have required artificial channel modification that would have created different downstream risks. The bank was protected at the new position with a continuous revetment consistent with the design standards I had used for my original installation. The willow and elderberry plantings were re-established along the top of the new revetment. The buffer strip was narrower than it had been before the demolition. It would remain narrower because the bank erosion that had occurred could not be fully reversed without major channel modification that was neither appropriate nor necessary. The 8 feet of buffer width that had been lost during the October storm event were gone permanently. I walked the completed remediation work on a May afternoon with the riparian contractor and Gerald Alderman. The new revetment was continuous and correct. The plantings were establishing. The creek was running at its normal spring flow within its stabilized channel. Gerald said, "This is what the original work looked like." I said, "Similar design. The new installation benefits from the better specified anchor system I have developed since I did the original work. It will perform better than the original over time." He said, "You designed the original 9 years ago, and you designed the remediation." I said, "I have been studying this reach for 9 years. There is institutional knowledge in that period that another engineer would not have." He said, "Constance did not understand what she was dealing with." I said, "Constance did not ask anyone who understood it." I offered to provide technical guidance to every board that has been in place during my 9 years here. Howard Birch used that guidance. The boards after him largely did not. Gerald said, "I want to change that." I said, "I would welcome that." We walked back from the creek to the development. The buffer strip was green and establishing and narrower than it had been. The creek was where it was and would stay where it was. The documentation was filed and the settlement was paid and the remediation was done. Mabel Fontaine, who had been on the prior board and who had voted against the buffer management policy when it had finally come to a full board vote, stopped me at the path edge. She said, "Sealers, I want to say something." I said, "Say it." She said, "I voted against the policy. I thought you should know that I read your technical statement in the injunction application and I understood it. I tried to stop this." I said, "I know you voted against it. I saw the record. I appreciate it. She said, does it help to know that? I said it helps to know that there was someone on the board who read the technical documentation and understood it. It does not change what happened, but yes, it helps. She said, the creek is stabilized now. I said, for the foreseeable future, ongoing monitoring will be required. Gerald has agreed to include that in the HOA's maintenance budget. She said, you will do the monitoring. I said, I will do the monitoring for as long as I live here. She said, how long will you live here? I said, I bought this property because of the creek. I have spent 9 years understanding this particular reach of this particular watershed. That kind of knowledge about a place takes a long time to build, and I have no intention of leaving it behind. She went back to the development. I stood at the path edge for a moment looking at the creek. The water moved the way it always moved in May, clear and purposeful, carrying the melt and the spring rain toward the larger watershed it belonged to. The stabilized bank held the channel where it was. The willows at the top of the new revetment were leafing out. The creek did not know it had been the subject of a legal dispute. It did not know about the buffer management policy or the demolition or the settlement or the remediation. It knew the shape of its channel and the resistance of its banks and the forces that moved it and the obstacles that stopped it. And it worked with all of these the way it had always worked with them, with the patient indifference of water that has been finding its way through this landscape for 10,000 years and will continue finding its way after every person involved in this situation has finished mattering to it. I had spent 31 years studying that indifference. I had learned to respect it. The board had not learned to respect it. The board had learned from the settlement, which was a different and less complete education, but it was the education available to people who had not done the reading beforehand. I went back to my workshop and updated my monitoring log with the post-remediation baseline readings. The sensor array showed normal spring flow conditions. The bank stability indicators were within expected parameters for newly installed revetment. The documentation was current. The creek was stable. Everything was as it should be. That was enough. Thumbnail text, he warned them 4 times in writing. They demolished his creek barrier anyway. The river settled the argument for good.